Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Newseum's Walter and Leonore Annenberg Theater. I'm Jan Newharth, Chair and Chief Executive Officer of the Freedom Forum. We're delighted to welcome you all here tonight for a very special evening, as we are joined by one of the country's most revered political columnists, George Will. George began his column with the Washington Post 45 years ago and continues to write a twice-weekly syndicated column on politics and domestic and foreign affairs. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in Commentary in 1977 and is currently a regular contributor to MSNBC and NBC News. George is also the author of 15 books, including his latest, The Conservative Sensibility, which he'll discuss tonight, that delivers a profound reflection on American conservatism in today's political climate. As Ted Koppel put it in a recent CBS Sunday Morning profile, George is a conservative rock, unmoved by the chaos raging around him. We are fortunate to also be joined by S.E. Cupp, who will moderate tonight's conversation. S.E. is a political commentator and host of CNN's S.E. Cupp Unfiltered, a weekly Saturday program covering the intersection of politics and media. She is a nationally syndicated political columnist and regularly writes for the New York Daily News, Glamour, and CNN.com. S.E. also appears in a Newseum video that is part of our exhibit 1776, Breaking News Independence, which tells the story of what led the colonies to adopt the Declaration of Independence. As many of you know, after 11 years and nearly 10 million visitors, the Newseum will close on December 31st, 2019. We want to thank everyone who visited, and especially many of our members and donors in the audience tonight, whose support helped make it possible. The Freedom Forum, creator and primary funder of the Newseum, remains committed to continuing the Newseum's mission to increase public understanding of the importance of a free press and the First Amendment. That work is needed now more than ever and will continue through digital platforms, educational initiatives, traveling exhibits, and public programs like this one tonight, both in Washington, D.C. and around the country. Following tonight's program, George will be signing copies of his book in the Great Hall of News on Level 1, where you can also purchase a copy from the Newseum store. And I do want to give special thanks to George, an absolute baseball fan who has written best-selling books about the sport, for missing the start of tonight's Nationals-Dodgers playoff game in order to be with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our moderator, S.E. Cupp, and our special guest, George Will.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Jan, and thank you all for coming. I'm really sad that this place isn't going to exist in its current iteration because it's so important. And I'm glad that the mission of the Freedom Forum and the Newseum is going to continue. But you're all a huge part of that. So I want to thank you for coming to events like this and continuing your support. George Will, it's an honor. And I brought this. This is not to deter you from reading it. No. Every word is brilliant, but set aside a year. No, it's terrific, but it is in many ways the culmination of sort of your lifetime of scholarship. This is not just your latest book, as it were. There's a lot of things this book is. There's a lot of things this book is not. For one, it's not an answer to Donald Trump. You don't mention him once in 540 pages. It is not designed, you write, to tell us what to think about this or that particular problem or policy. You call it instead an exercise in intellectual archaeology. What do you mean?
Well, Bill Maher made a big deal when I was on the show. He said, Donald Trump's name doesn't appear in this. And I said, neither does Doris Day's. and for the same reason, that it's a book about ideas. What I mean by intellectual archaeology is this. Margaret Thatcher once said, rightly, that European nations were made by history, America's nation was made by philosophy. And when conservatives are asked, as they properly are, what do they want to conserve? My answer is the American founding, which is to say the doctrine of natural rights, the idea that first come rights and then come government. Our rights are not given to us by government. That human nature is a constant, and it is fallible and not perfectible. And in order to have a government strong enough to protect our rights, but not too strong so that it threatens them, we need to have a separation of powers and checks and balances and all the rest. The progressive overthrow of this has been remarkably forthright. Woodrow Wilson particularly said the founders were okay once, but their doctrine is an anachronism now that he said we are a country united by steel rails and copper wires, a continental nation unlike the framers' nation where there were only 4 million Americans and 80% of them lived within 20 miles of Atlantic tidewater. And the argument, I think, and I say this with some pride as a Princetonian, is between James Madison of the Princeton class of 1771 and Woodrow Wilson of the Princeton class of 1879. As I say, the progressives have been forthright and remarkably successful, but they didn't count on my book, which will now reverse 100 years of history.
Well, and I want to ask you about progressivism, but there's something you write in the introduction about the importance of linking today's political arguments back to centuries-old debates. You write, quote, "We can dignify our present disputes among small persons of little learning by connecting them with great debates about fundamental things." We call that a subtweet in my business. Yeah. Are you talking about any group of people in particular, or just all of them?
No, look, we live in any age under the tyranny of the bell-shaped curve. A few people are god-awful, a few people are really excellent, and most people in the middle are sort of middling. But we've had episodes in American history, the American founding, when we miraculously got those 55 people to the convention in Philadelphia in 1787. The progressives, as I tip my cap to them. They were from Teddy Roosevelt through Woodrow Wilson, Herbert Crowley, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, serious, formidable people. But we're all arguing with the American founders, with and about. So it's very important to have the exhilarating company of these great men, particularly James Madison.
Well, I want to ask you about Herbert Crowley. Progressivism today is ascendant, and so it's a real good time to look back at some breakthrough moments. One of those was the publication in 1909 of Herbert Crowley's The Promise of American Life. It's since never been out of print. He was nicknamed Crowleyer than thou.
Yes.
You call it a manifesto for the progressive movement, and he wrote in it that the average American individual is morally and intellectually inadequate to a serious and consistent conception of his responsibilities as a Democrat. So national life should be a school, and the exigencies of such schooling frequently demand severe coercive measures, but what schooling does not. Talk about the influence of Crowley and that book.
Well, Crowley's, the influence of the book is astonishing. There are very few books, if any, published in 1909 in this country that have never been out of print. Louis Brandeis gave a copy to Teddy Roosevelt before he went off on his famous post-presidential safari to Africa. It led to the founding of the New Republic, of which Crowley was editor. What Crowley did was articulate the fact that there was science in the air around the turn of the century. Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers, Marconi, and a tremendous confidence that we could apply science to society and have a properly planned, rational society if we could concentrate more and more power in Washington, more and more Washington power in the executive branch, and more executive branch power in an unfettered, what we would often call an imperial presidency, thereby marginalizing Congress. Conservatives, until fairly recently, were big believers in the supremacy of Congress, not just that Congress is a co-equal branch, but that it is superior. It is Article 1 of the Constitution for a reason. It creates all the courts other than the Supreme Court. It confirms all significant judicial and executive officers. It's involved in the declaration of war, although it hasn't, that power has atrophied since last used on June 4th, 1942, when we declared war just to tidy up the legalities of World War II. We declared war on Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. So Herbert Crowley represented the belief that expertise should now be applied to organizing society and elevating what he, with, again, remarkable candor, called in his judgment unregenerate American citizens.
I want to ask about the fundamental changes the presidency, the executive has undergone since the days of Washington, Madison, even LBJ. One of those that you identify is, of course, how the president communicates with the people. Now, under the current executive, almost entirely by Twitter, through an occasional press conference, through a gaggle once in a while. Talk about how that has changed, not just the medium, but how we organize politics into our lives.
The real revolution wasn't Twitter and the internet and social media. The real revolution, and it's difficult for us now to understand the impact it had, was radio. Woodrow Wilson was the first president to have, I think, a State of the Union address broadcast by radio. The immediacy that this gave. When Franklin Roosevelt gave his first fireside chat on the radio shortly after his inauguration, he began it with two words that do not appear in the transcript that is in the library at Hyde Park, but he began it, "My friends." Now, we've had presidents who claim to feel our pain. We live in this forced intimacy with presidents who are in our living rooms by television every night. Try, however, to imagine George Washington saying to a group of Americans, "My friends." He was austere, he was remote, he was reserved, he was reticent, he had a great gift of silence, as someone said. But we now live in this terrible intimacy with presidents who are semi-sacerdotal figures, our moral tutors. They express our national grief. They are just, it is an office so swollen that it now fills up the national consciousness. And I simply don't think that's healthy. I'm not talking about this president or any president. We have such a presidential-centric government now, not just government, but civic culture, that it's hard for other institutions of government to breathe.
Yeah, the presidency, as you indicate, has become this vessel into which we have poured immensely high expectations. He or she must solve all of our problems, both the complex and the mundane. They must reflect back to us our idealized versions of ourselves, and be the embodiment of all of our hopes and dreams. And you indict both progressives and conservatives for the omnipotence of presidents in American life. You say progressives want that for reasons of progressivism. They think boundless government is beneficent. And, quote, faux conservatives want it because they've forgotten their raison d'etre. What do you mean?
Well, conservatives used to understand that Teddy Roosevelt was with his stewardship idea of the presidency, which he said meant that presidents are free to do anything they're not explicitly forbidden to do. Woodrow Wilson came along with his idea of the president as the interpreter of the national mood. Franklin Roosevelt came along and revolutionized the relationship of the individual to the central government. Lyndon Johnson, who came to Washington as a young New Dealer in the 1930s, the only president who spent most of his adult life in Washington. So conservatives had adhered to the idea of congressional supremacy, fearing, as the founders did, executive power, until they had the heady experience of Ronald Reagan. And they said, gee, this is fun, having a president of our persuasion. And they lost some of their hitherto wholesome suspicion of presidential power. And what's happened, Barack Obama infuriated a lot of conservatives by saying, I have a phone and I have a pen, and if I can't do something with Congress, I'll do it by executive order. The immigration policy is the example. Well, along comes the first Republican president after Mr. Obama, and he says, well, I'm going to declare by executive order, I'll declare an emergency and slap tariffs on metal imported from our NATO ally, Canada, as a national security emergency, and I will take money appropriated by Congress for one purpose, and I will repurpose it to build a wall. And Democrats would say, well, that's terrible. Where do you get these bad habits? And then one of the Democratic candidates for president, Kamala Harris, says, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give, as president, I will give Congress 100 days to pass the kind of gun control legislation I want, and if they don't, I'll do it by executive order. So a kind of lawlessness has crept into this, which has to occur when Congress stops legislating. Congress is really making not laws, but it's making other legislators of the executive branch. Congress passes sentiments. We should have a clean environment. You over in the executive department write the details. We should have quality education. The education department will fill in the details. If you walk into Senator Mike Lee's office, Senator Republican from Utah, you'll see two stacks of paper. One's about that thick, and it's the laws passed by Congress in a given session. The other's 8 feet tall. It's all the rules and regulations churned out by the executive regulatory agencies in the same period, which is a graphic demonstration of who really governs us. Congress says, well, presidents have usurped our power. Would that presidents had to usurp the power? Under Congresses of both parties, presidents of both parties have been given vast discretion, for example, to impose tariffs. Now think about that. Tariffs are taxes collected at the border and paid by Americans. But presidents are given this vast power to impose tariffs at their discretion. It's a very odd behavior for a country that was founded in a war, fought over tea and tariffs and taxes and things.
I'm wondering if you think the American people, if you think voters are implicated in this elevation of the presidency and the executive too.
Absolutely. We have, I'll say the worst, we have a representative government. It really does represent the American people. The American people get what they want. Not immediately, they're not supposed to. It's supposed to be hard to legislate. But eventually, public opinion will prevail. That's why Madison said we need ways to temper public opinion, to refine and filter it through representative institutions, to slow it down so it will be more reasonable. People say, well, the Founding Fathers didn't much like democracy because they were always talking about its problems. To which the founders would say, we talked only about its problems because it's the only form of government we ever considered. But there are problems. Huey Long was a problem. The current president is a problem. Populism is everything that conservatism isn't. Populism says we want that the vox Dei, vox populi, the voice of the people is the voice of God, that we want the passions of the people to be directly reflected in a strong leader, someone who might say, for example, only I can fix it. None of this nonsense about slowing and filtering and cooling public passions. Arouse passions and move the government. That's the essence of populism and the very essence of what conservatism is not.
You talk about how we treat history today. You write, history as a moral reflection has given way to history as cultural unmasking. The redemptive power of the past evaporates when historical actors come to be seen not as socially situated selves, but as socially saturated selves. What's that about?
Well, I'm afraid the way history is taught nowadays, it's a series of laments and indictments about the sins and misgovernment and failings of our country. Every country has a list of such things. But the idea that you can teach history, without any celebration of achievements, and B, some historians have said that democracy should be immune to heroes. Democracy should be immune to the idea that some people are more important than others. That it's undemocratic to say that a few people have had disproportionate impact. And therefore, we should teach history as a social history we should write books about the washerwomen of Paris from 1837 to 1922, that kind of doctoral dissertation. Whereas, when you do that, when you take the luminous figures and the great achievements out of history, guess what? Students find it boring and uninspiring, and they quit taking it. We've seen the number of history majors in our colleges drop precipitously as these kind of social historians have taken over and made history into a long-running, politically saturated indictment of the country.
I want to jump back to the influence of Lyndon Johnson. You say, regarding government's role, he remains the most consequential 19th century president.
20th century.
20th century.
Lyndon Johnson.
Yes, 20th century, sorry.
Right.
Unpack that.
Well, my book is dedicated to the memory of the man for whom I cast my first presidential vote, Barry Goldwater, who was described as a cheerful malcontent. And what I hope to demonstrate is that one can join that adjective and that noun in an otherwise rancorous and hostile time. Goldwater began a serious conversation in his constructively losing race. I like to say he didn't lose in '64, although he only he lost 44 states, but he actually won. It only took 16 years to count the votes. What he did was he really began a serious argument in this country about the proper scope and actual competence of government. In losing as dramatically as he did to Lyndon Johnson, Johnson swept in on his coattails an enormous number of liberal legislators in Congress. Between 1938 and 1964, there was no liberal legislative majority in Congress because in 1937, Franklin Roosevelt, impatient with the fact that the Supreme Court had been an impediment to some New Deal programs, he tried to pack the Supreme Court. He proposed to Congress that they pack the Supreme Court, and Democrats in Congress, controlling both houses with large majorities, stopped it. Enraged, Franklin Roosevelt toured the country trying to purge Democrats who had opposed him. All the people he tried to purge won anyway. And others were swept in, and between 38 and 64, as I say, there was no liberal legislative majority. After the Goldwater landslide, and there's a paradox of history here, there was, particularly for 2 years, 65 and 66, the whole liberal agenda could be implemented, producing an enormous recoil in the country. Medicare and Medicaid, fine, they were popular. Model cities, lots of other programs with grand names that disappointed people. And it coincided with an enormous explosion in welfare programs and spending, an enormous explosion in civil unrest in the country. And people began to be sympathetic to a Republican argument that government isn't as smart as it thinks it is, that more things should be left to markets, which, well, all a market is an information-generating mechanism. that markets are wiser than government, any government under any party can be. So the paradox is that in losing, Goldwater created the conditions for a receptivity for the limited government ideas that he advocated.
Conservatism, writ large, is a set of values that still exists somewhere, brilliantly outlined here. But in practice, I'm wondering where you see it most evidenced today. For example, David Horowitz was fond 10, 15 years ago of saying that pop culture is a lot more conservative than we realize it is, and he would always cite shows like Friends and Will and Grace, who he would say portray unorthodox families, but family units nonetheless. Some would say homeschooling and the rise of homeschooling is evidence that conservatism has really taken root. Today, it feels difficult to see where conservatism is thriving. Where is that happening that we might not expect or see?
Well, first let me say, I could have called this book The American Conservative Sensibility, because European conservatism grew out of a belief that it needed to buttress order, throne and altar, blood and soil, hierarchical societies. The canonical founding text of European conservatism is Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, his eloquent and forceful recoil against revolutionary upheaval. In the United States, it's different. Conservatism in the United States welcomes change and flux and dynamism and creative destruction of capitalism, to use the phrase of the great economist Joseph Schumpeter. Someone once said, it was Virginia Postrel, who's a fine writer in this town, said, the story of the Bible reduced to one sentence is, God created men and women and lost control of events. The conservative sensibility finds that exhilarating, that the openness of the future, the spontaneous order of a market society, no Herbert Crowley's trying to organize our unregenerate selves, the sheer dynamism of America. Now, this has cultural consequences. It's unsettling. One of the great hymns of praise to capitalism as a dynamic force is in the Communist Manifesto, where Karl Marx says, under capitalism, everything solid disappears into air. Some of us like that. That's the conservative sensibility. Many conservatives are religious, and they find all of this upsetting to traditional norms, and they're disoriented by the change in this understanding of marriage and sexuality and all the rest. The chapter in my book that I had most fun writing is called Conservatism Without Theism. Let me speak to that for just a moment. I have described myself as an amiable, low-voltage atheist. I'm married to a ferocious Presbyterian. But a little autobiographical digression here. My father, his father was a Lutheran minister in Western Pennsylvania. And my father, as a young boy, would sit outside Pastor Will's study and listen to Pastor Will, his father, trying to reason with members of his congregation to try and reconcile the doctrine of free will and grace. This made my father into a philosopher, professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois, and I grew up in an utterly secular household. And the point of my chapter there is to say it is just wrong to think that conservatism implies or depends upon some theism, that you have to be religious to be conservative. That point has been blurred because of the strong role of the Christian conservatives and the religious right and all that. Again, I fully understand how the kind of vertigo that a great many cultural conservatives feel about the change in our time. I mean, think back this, in 2004, in an effort to turn out conservative voters, the Bush campaign, George W. Bush reelection campaign, helped orchestrate 11 states having referenda defining marriage as between a man and a woman. All 11 passed, all 11 by double digits. 15 years later, I don't think that would happen. The American people are amazingly malleable and changeable and open to arguments. And what I have tried to do in my book is say, this is real conservatism, the embrace of the unexpected, the exhilarating openness of the future, not the planned future of Herbert Crowley, but the truly open future of a market society.
I too am an atheist. I like to say I don't believe in God, but I'm not mad at him.
That's right.
Can we talk about science for a minute?
Please.
This seems a natural next step. You write about the persistent phenomenon that politics doesn't always account for human ingenuity, discovering and innovating. Sometimes scientists miss it too. There are countless examples of this as recent as Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren, and all the way back to Malthus, who I don't think you mentioned, but is sort of implied when you talk about population control and those sort of things. What's your message there, and how can that be applied to current arguments? Say climate. On the one hand, you have many Republican lawmakers and the president denying climate change is real and in part man-made. On the other, you've got prescriptions about what to do, ranging from incremental and therefore maybe not very effective to sweeping and therefore maybe impractical.
Well, the science is simply respecting facts and following them where they go. My problem in the climate argument is this. I've been called a climate change denier, which is weird. I mean, it'd be impossible to state with greater precision the opposite of my views, which is, of course, the climate is changing. It always is changing. I grew up in central Illinois. 10,000 years before I was born, it was covered by 100 feet of ice. I'm awfully glad we had climate change. The question is, do we understand the complex dynamics of the Earth's atmosphere and oceans and all the rest? I just read a wonderful book called Nature's Mutiny. It's about the cultural consequences and scientific mystery to this day of the Little Ice Age of the late 16th and early 17th centuries in Europe, the most astonishing and consequential climate change in history. The one thing we do know about that is it was not caused by a carbon-based economy. It was not caused by the internal combustion engine. It was not caused by 7 billion people on the planet. Now, there's nothing implausible or counterintuitive about the fact that the activities of 7.5 billion people in a carbon-based economy will have climate consequences. To find out what they are, then we have to decide we can try and stop climate change or we can accommodate to climate change. Those are cost-benefit analyses. But they're all based on evidence. What is really shocking to me are the number of people who say the argument is over, case is closed, everyone shut up and listen and do what we tell you. When the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced one of its recent reports, the New Yorker said, the New Yorker, mind you, said the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, comma, which should be, but unfortunately will not be taken as the last word in climate science, comma, and then it went on. Now, ladies and gentlemen, try and say that sentence with, say, microbiology or organic chemistry in there, the last word in organic chemistry. The last word in microbiology. There's no such thing in science. Science is, it's open or it's nothing. The essence of a scientific proposition is that it can be falsified. If it can't be falsified, it's not a meaningful proposition. And that's my problem with the climate changes argument as we're having it today. I mean, I listen to the Democratic candidates, and remember, I'm not a member of either party. I've got no dog in this fight. And they say, we are all going to perish. We're going to die unless we do A, B, C, D, E, and F, and we're not going to do any of those things. They know it and we know it. We're not going to retrofit every American building in the next 10 years, which they pledged to do. We're not going to wean ourselves off fossil fuels in 10 years. Not going to come close. So we're either going to die or we're going to find out that they were wrong, that it's a falsified proposition.
What a game of chicken. As you just said, you are not a member of either party. A commonly accepted notion now is that Trump has co-opted conservatism, or at the very least hijacked the GOP. Some have left the party as a result. People want to know, and I get asked this all the time, how or whether that gets undone. I have said Trump wore the Republican Party like a rented tuxedo to get elected, and now the tuxedo's in the corner, crumpled, stained, cigarette butts. Can the Republican Party ever get those stains out?
Well, ever's a long time. Depends on whether there are two terms. One term's a mistake, two terms is a pattern. The Republican Party today might be more homogeneous, might be more unified than at any time since it was formed in Beloit, Wisconsin in 1854. The 20th century politics is a story of Republican factionalism, vigorous, violent arguments in the party. 1912, Republican William Howard Taft is president, and the man who got him there, Teddy Roosevelt, decides he'd like to be president again. So he runs against his friend and mentee, William Howard Taft. This scrap between the progressive Republicans and the conservative Republicans was replicated in the 1940s between New York Governor Tom Dewey and Ohio Senator Robert Taft. Again in the 1960s between New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller and Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Today, there is no such argument in the Republican Party, which is why I say it's more homogeneous. At the 500-day mark of Ronald Reagan's presidency, he had the support of 77% of Republicans, which was considered high. Today, the president has the support, or at 500-day mark, had the support of 87% of Republicans, and today it's probably higher. Now, some people say, well, they don't really believe him, they're just frightened. I don't care what the motive is. There's no affection for the president and the Republican ranks in Congress, but they know the costs of crossing him, now that the Republican base is entirely belongs to the president. They've seen what happened to Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee, Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona, Congressman Sanford of South Carolina, and there simply will be no dissent.
What could the GOP ever win you back? What would it take?
I'll tell you a story. Margaret Thatcher, after she was elected leader of the Conservative Parliamentary Party, but before she became prime minister, was in a meeting with her members, and one of them was up nattering on and on at great length about the beauties of centrism and the irrelevance of political philosophy. And she reached into her capacious handbag, took out Frederick Hayek's great tome, The Constitution of Liberty, slammed it on the table and said, "This is what we believe." I'm sure that someday the leader of the Republican Party will pick up the conservative sensibility, slam it on a desk and say, "This is what we believe." When the current president leaves, there will be a rethinking. For example, if there's anything that most people understood, and all Republicans understood, is that free trade is an excellent thing. Everyone benefits, both ends of a transaction. It's voluntary. Not surprisingly, they both think they're getting something out of it. The obvious benefits of free trade is one of the reasons why markets have been so well thought of, and one of the reasons why the economics profession and academia is one of the few academic fields to move to the right in the last 60 years. Along came Mr. Trump, and people said, we believe in free trade. He said, no, you don't. And so they said, okay, we don't. And that was the end of that. Now, they're going to have to rethink. The problem is it's going to be very difficult for them to not look as though they're doing intellectual somersaults and to have any credibility in this.
Too late.
I think it's going to be very difficult because I can think of no serious dissent. I mean, there's some senators doing good, robust resistance. Chuck Grassley of Iowa, 82 years old in his 7th term. Says, I'm just a farmer from Butler County, Iowa. He's a shrewd chairman now of the Finance Committee, the most important committee in some ways in the Senate. Rob Portman of Ohio and Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania trying to claw back power from the presidency to Congress. So there's signs of life, but the pulse is weak. And whether or not the Republican Party can be credible again as an advocate of the rule of law and limited government is a very open question.
I want to turn it over to audience questions, but I just have one final for you. What's the greatest thing you've ever read? Fiction, nonfiction, and why?
Greatest book.
Greatest thing
Well, I'm a book person.
ever read.
I have, at any time, I get up at 5:30 every morning, and on my phone I have Audible books.
Okay.
I've got 40 at any given time, and I start listening to a book while I shave, commuting, eating breakfast, walking to lunch, driving home. I listen to Audible books 2.5, 3 hours a day. I go through 70 or 80 books in otherwise wasted time in a year.
Yeah.
So I've got a lot of books to consider here.
Okay.
Fiction. I'll give you fiction. I'll
Great.
give you two. One is Huckleberry Finn. The other is Great Gatsby.
Okay.
Throw in a third, Middlemarch by George Eliot. And it's awfully hard as an American to beat de Tocqueville's Democracy in America and the Federalist Papers about de Tocqueville. There's a wonderful scene in that book, which has been rightly called the greatest book ever written by a country by a citizen of another country. He's floating down the Ohio River with slave-holding Kentucky on his left and free soil Ohio on his right. And he said, Kentucky is torpid and sleepy and no sign of life. Just across the river, Ohio crackles with energy of an entrepreneurial, free society celebrating free labor, free land, free people. I believe that capitalism doesn't just make us better off, which it manifestly does, having produced the great enrichment since the 1780s and James Watt's steam engine, but it doesn't make us better off, it makes us better by enforcing certain stern virtues, thrift, industriousness, deferral of gratification, individualism. So I would recommend those two novels and two books.
Terrific. I have 8 hours more questions, but we don't have time. So folks, if you have a question, please come up to either of the microphones. And if you could keep your questions concise, Mr. Will would like to get to a baseball game. You. Come on down, don't be shy.
I can't have answered all your questions.
Yes, sir.
Hi, good evening.
Yeah.
I know you said recently that you only write about politics to support your baseball habit. Is there any analogy or any story, a baseball story that you could give to describe the transformation that this country has had over the last 3.5 years, and where do you think it might be going in the future?
Well, I do think baseball is the right game for a democracy for several reasons. First of all, there's a lot of failure and compromise in it. Best hitter in baseball was Ty Cobb. He had a career batting average of, I think, 367, which means he failed more than 60% of the time. Every team goes to spring training knowing it's going to win 60 games and no one's going to lose 60 games. You play the whole damn 162 games to sort out the middle 42. If you win 10 out of 20 games, you're mediocre. You win 11 out of 20 games, you'll probably play in October. So it's a game of failure and coming to terms with reality. Baseball right now has some problems. When you have more hits than strikeouts, as we now do, when you have 4 minutes before the ball put in play, because there are only 3 true outcomes anymore, walk, strikeout, home run. Home run, the ball's not in play, it's in the bleachers. The game got distorted in a way that our politics has been distorted by shrillness and extremism and all the rest. But baseball, I think, will correct, and I think democracy's correct. No one ever got rich betting against this country. And the American people are not fools.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Decades ago, when I was in college and taking a course on political parties, the professor was talking about the need for each party to have both conservatives and liberals in the party. And he insisted that government would not work if you had a party divided by liberals and conservatives. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I
Why?
do. Your professor was right, and he was probably in a minority if this was 60 years ago. Because 60 years ago, the political scientists said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could sort our parties out into distinct, tidy, clear ideological groupings? Well, I came to Washington in 1970 to work on the Senate staff for a Republican senator. The Senate then was run by Democrats, of course. McClellan of Arkansas, Stennis and Eastland of Mississippi, Irvin of North Carolina, Russell of Georgia, Sparkman of Alabama. They were jumping up and down on poor Joe Biden in one of the debates, saying he tried to get along with conservative Southern Democrats. That's all he had to deal with at that point. Now, there were problems there, but it seemed to me it worked better. The Republicans, when I came to town, had liberals like Case of New Jersey, Brooke of Massachusetts, Percy of Illinois, Keating and Javits of New York. It led to accommodations in a way that we don't have it now. Your professor was right.
Thank you.
Hello. Last week on the episode of South Park, they said that you have to lower your standards of freedom to supple from the warm teat of China. And I was wondering if you thought the world's democracies made a bet 20 years ago with China, opening up free trade with them, that they have now regretted.
There's no question that The Economist of London, a very measured periodical, recently said the West made a bet and lost. The bet was made in 1972 when Nixon went to China. For 40 years under both parties, Republicans and Democrats equally, our wager was this, that if we enmeshed China in the world trading system and opened it to capital and investment, China was admitted to the WTO in 2001. If we did this, the culture of capitalism would dissolve tyranny, because you have to have freedom of information, contracts, promise-keeping, independent judiciary to arbitrate disputes, and all the rest. The wager was that you could not have authoritarianism in a market society. It's wrong, can. They've figured out how to do it. Now, I think they don't have that much of a market society. I think they're a much more fragile economy than they seem. I think China is way overrated as an economic powerhouse. But unquestionably, the wager we made didn't work out. And now we have to deal with the consequences for 20 or 30 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. One of the books that I loved was Aaron David Miller, when he wrote The End of Greatness, Why America doesn't want, or I can't say it doesn't have nor want another great president. I don't know if you read it. He talked about there was 3 great presidents in his mind, because everyone loves lists: Washington, Lincoln, and Roosevelt, FDR Roosevelt. He said that was it. And he talked about the pros and cons. And he did note that Obama, everyone thought he was going to be the next great one. but was never allowed to even attempt that, and too much was placed on a pedestal. So my question for you is, who would you rate as the top? Are we ever going to see another great president?
I think so. And be careful what you wish for, because greatness is usually drawn out of people by huge crises.
Which is what he said.
The founding of the Republic produced George Washington. The preservation of the Republic produced Lincoln. The need to get the country off its knees from the Depression produced Franklin Roosevelt. But it's an old worry. In, I think it was 1888, Lord Bryce, a great British scholar and ambassador, wrote a book called The American Commonwealth, one chapter of which is why great men are not chosen to be president. And this was in the second half of the 19th century, when indeed there were few great men president. Except for the great Grover Cleveland, one of my pin-ups, but that's another matter. Grover Cleveland once, there was a big drought in Texas, and Congress appropriated $10,000, a princely sum, to provide seed for the farmers in Texas, and Grover Cleveland vetoed it, saying, show me the enumerated power in Article 1, Section 8 that says we can send seeds to Texas. Admired that, but anyway. I think those three you mentioned are the greatest. I would, fourth place, I would put Ronald Reagan, who came in and someone said, what's your view of the Cold War? He says, we win, they lose. And we won and they lost. And you go up out here in where we just had our reception, you'll see a piece of the Berlin Wall. He reignited America's confidence after an extraordinarily dispiriting period of Vietnam and assassinations and rampant inflation. So I think they're great men. I think a very underestimated president is Dwight Eisenhower, who got the country through a very perilous period in the Cold War, began to build the ballistic missiles and all the rest that helped us deter and ultimately win the Cold War. We will see big men again, and women.
That's great. Thank you.
Yep.
And good luck with the Nationals. Next year for the Red Sox.
I feel like James Garfield gets short shrift because he was only in for 100 days. But he was historically at a really important, consequential time after Lincoln and Restoration.
Absolutely.
You have to write his book so that more people learn about him.
Okay.
Okay. We have a young questioner here.
Stand on your tiptoes. That's good.
So how we gone from like Watergate to now Trump, and how democracy in America has been changing? Do you think like democracy will survive in America, or just in the world in general? Like, do you think it's going down down a slippery slope, or?
Well, there are fewer democracies today than there were 20 years ago. And there are some democracies in form that are not really democracies. Hungary is an example. There are populist movements that are anti-democratic in the sense that they want to overthrow all institutional impediments to majority rule. And there's a lot more to democracy than pure majoritarianism. On the other hand, I mean, people say the current president is authoritarian, that he's an incipient tyrant. He can't even get his two choices for the Federal Reserve Board of governors on. I mean, real tyrants annex the Sudetenland and invade Poland. This is messy, what's going on, and it's not good for us. And it brings democracy into disrepute when it's as ugly and as mendacious and as powered by transparent lying and all that. But the institutions themselves, the courts and the press and all the rest, they're still strong. They really are. So you're going to live in a democracy for the next 60 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. My direction here is overall gun control, but with that background, I am a veteran, but the last 17 years I have been an educator. Now, in the history of education, when families would send their children to school without feeding them or without being able to provide food, we, the school system, said, okay, we will take that on. We will feed your children. When the school said, when the people said, well, we have trouble, we don't have anything to do with our children after school, we, the school system, said, we will establish after-school programs, and we will monitor your children and give them some exercise, those kind of things. When society developed the problem of teenage pregnancies, and young ladies were no longer able to go to school because they had children, we, the school system, said, we will establish some daycares within our school. We will help you because we understand the importance of education. Unfortunately, in my view, the view now is your children are not protected, there's school shootings. We, the school system, will now arm our teachers. And as an educator, I think that is not a mission we should take on. We should not be arming teachers.
Sir, I'm sorry, do you have a
ensure.
question?
So my question is,
Thank you.
how do we, in light of the Constitution, which says freedom to bear arms, how do we provide that safe environment without, at the same time, making police force out of our teachers? How do we?
I don't think there's anything close to an American majority that wants to arm teachers. The Heller decision, which in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court affirmed the individual right, not the collective right of militias, but the individual right to bear arms, arose, of course, from this city. But if you read the Heller decision, it leaves lots of room for gun control. It just does. Second, we've had horrific school shootings. But school's a very safe place, basically, in this country. Very safe. What we have to do is learn how to spot and how to respond to disturbed young people before they walk into the school with semi-automatic weapons and large magazines. But I think it would be a mistake for us, particularly in the media, to convince people that we live in a society where school children are in imminent danger, because they're not.
Ma'am?
Hello. I wanted to ask you about the climate from which the 25th Amendment emerged, and about the use of the 25th Amendment not from a medical diagnosis standpoint, but the conversation they had about the unmanned helm.
About the
unmanned helm, that the idea that that there should always be someone at the helm who is ready and prepared. And then I also wanted to ask you if there are other implied rights in the Constitution that are unwritten but would be standards, like a right to privacy. Can we imply those things?
Sure. The right to privacy was described by the Supreme Court as an emanation of other rights. So we've seen the Supreme Court reason in that way, that certain rights as a constellation imply other rights. The Ninth Amendment explicitly says, because when they set about to pass a Bill of Rights, in order to promise a Bill of Rights, in order to get the state conventions to ratify the Constitution, some people said, no, don't have a Bill of Rights, because when you start enumerating rights, that will imply that that's all there are, and you might forget some. So they added to the Bill of Rights the Ninth Amendment, which says the enumeration of rights in this document shall not be construed to disparage or discount unenumerated rights. So that consigned us to a perpetual argument about what they are. If you don't like to argue, you pick the wrong country. And this is what Americans do. 25th Amendment is written to take care of Woodrow Wilson and others. I mean, Woodrow Wilson had a stroke. That's what you're talking about, right? Okay. Woodrow Wilson had a stroke. He served for a year and a half, really unable to govern. We might have had our first female president in Edith Wilson, who took charge, really, while he was incapacitated. That was written for a purpose, to deal with incapacitated presidents. We had Eisenhower have a stroke and heart attacks and other things. But it's no way to remove a president. There's a clear mechanism about how you do it. You get the president's cabinet agrees. But to remove a president who's unworthy of the office, we have what's called impeachment. Don't need the 25th Amendment.
We'll take one more question.
Sure.
You may touch upon this in your book. I don't know, I'm only up to chapter 4, but do you have a sense whether or not the moderate voice in politics will ever be resurrected? And second question, would you have pitched Corbyn last night?
Take the most important question first. Yes, I'd have pitched Corbyn. We got 3 good starters and a pretty weak bullpen. And Corbyn just didn't have it. That happens. Sandy Koufax lost a bunch of games in his career. Happens to people. The first part of your question again?
Moderate voice?
Moderate, yeah. Look, I think there's a moderate majority in America today. And all it takes is one of the two parties to nominate a moderate who says to the American people, deep breath, calm down. Lincoln said at the end of his first inaugural, he says, we are not enemies, we must not be enemies. And he said that at a time when 7 states had already seceded and you could see the cannon across the river. Our disagreements are small potatoes compared to what Lincoln had to deal with. And the stakes are small compared to the question of whether some human beings could own other human beings. So once we get our perspective back, our political parties really are, when they're functioning well, acutely responsive market mechanisms. And they will find the majority. And that's the drama of the Democratic presidential contest right now, is a whole bunch of people think the American people want a revolution. The American people are not angry and they're not revolutionary. They're exhausted and they're sad and they're embarrassed. And they want restoration of something like normality. So I think the market's going to work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George Will. The book is The Conservative Sensibility. Mr. Will be signing books directly after this. So if you brought a copy, or I assume you can buy a copy, get your book signed. Thank you so much.